Let me also thank Menelaus for organizing this conference and particularly for inviting me to participate here. I'm presenting a paper on macros, so I do the macro part of this session. And as you see, we look at the anchoring of consumers' inflation expectations based on microdata, and the paper title basically tells what we're doing. So we're looking at some form of anchoring, and the form of anchoring expectation we have in mind is that we believe that we should look at co-movement between expectations. So we look at the co-movement between short-run inflation expectations and long-run expectations. By believing that if you have a short-term shock or a shock into the inflation rate, this should mainly affect short-term expectations. If you believe that you have a central bank which has inflation targeting, which is very committed to fight inflation, this should not affect your long-term expectations. Because in the short term, well, you know that every shock currently will affect 1 year ahead expectations, but if the central bank reacts sufficiently strong by raising real interest rates to dampen output, then the long-run expectation should not move. So anchoring would be then that the lower this co-movement is, the higher the anchoring of expectations are, because any short-term shock is not transmitted to long-term expectations. And we'll look at this using consumer data, which is almost never the case, because usually people look at financial market data, and we will look at a very rich data set. We have individual level data and track expectations over 6 months, so we can at least 6 months, sometimes even 2 years, at 4 points. So we can see how expectations change. So we have a nice identification over time and over the cross-section. So why do it in the first place? We're talking about impact, so I have to also cite somebody here. So you can name, for instance, Bernanke, and well, he states this anchoring of inflation expectations is one of the most important tasks of monetary policy, and you're wondering why. Well, you have to look into Finalis and Williams, and they say, well, because it helps. It helps to stabilize. Price stability helps it stabilizes output and employment by ensuring price stability in the long run. So it's a win-win situation. You get stable economic growth, at the same time you get stable price, and this is, from welfare perspective, very optimal. So this is a good thing. So we should basically have well-anchored expectations. But, well, if we should have it, why should we bother right now? Well, we see that we're living in the world with very ultra-expansionary monetary policy. We have ultra-low interest rates, quantitative easing, so a lot of things is going on. And if we look at the full distribution of expectations, for instance, from the survey of professional forecaster, we see that before the crisis, the distribution was quite around the mean of 2%, around the inflation target, and now it's starting to flatten out. So the tails become bigger. So people are now thinking, well, either I have now in the future very high inflation because the central banks cannot take back all this super amount of money, amount of liquidity, or they will not be able to foster growth, and we are back in a recession and have deflation. So you see that the tails are picking up. So it's important now to look at anchoring from this perspective. And there's a second perspective, as people are discussing whether we should change this inflation target. And there's people by Ball which say we should do this because my life's easier, and people like Bernanke would say we shouldn't do this because it's a regime shift. So we're also asking, well, what effects do regime shift really have? And to answer this, we will look at cohorts. So does it, or if we see over time that the anchoring increases, so which means that monetary policy sufficiently convinced us that they will stick to the inflation target. Is this really a case because everybody believes that future inflation will be at 2%, or is it cohort dependent? Basically, do the old people who do not believe in the central bank just die out, and this increased anchoring is driven by the new cohorts that enter into the survey? So we look at cohorts separately, and then we see if this cohort-specific anchoring is the same as the aggregate anchoring, and then might be able to answer such questions like whether it's really so innocent to increase inflation, target inflation from 2% to 4%, and then come back at a later point in time, or if it leads to some longer term disturbances, some longer costs we cannot assess so far. So, anchoring. Well, first of all, we have to note that there is not one measure of anchoring. People tend to disagree, and this is the case here as well. So we have some studies that basically look at deviation from some target to say, okay, if I'm close to this inflation target, this is good, and my expectations are anchored. If I'm far away, this is a problem. A lot of people look at responses of financial markets in high frequency. Gukenak has a lot of papers there where he just looks at, well, the response of 10-year inflation premiums to some news shocks. And he basically argues, well, if expectations are anchored, those news shocks should have no effect because they are 10 years away. So any macro movement, any inflation shock should have no effect if expectations are really, really anchored. And he checks basically the movement here. And finally, which is one of the very few papers that look at expectations, this is Isha, and he looks at whether they're telling consumers target their anchor their expectations closer to the professional ones. So, I said in this paper we look at the anchoring of consumers in the US. We use individual level survey data to identify changes between short-run and long-run expectations, which has for possible determinants. We do this to encompass also those financial market models because they basically look at whether some news shocks change the anchoring. So we also would like to see, in terms of news shocks, whether we can see any movement here. And I think this is a quite new part. Assess whether experience matters, especially the experience of high inflation spell matters for the level of anchoring. How should we set this up? How can we motivate this co-movement? Well, this was basically an argument, but if you draw a very, very simple model, follow Van Williams or Beachy, set up those three equations. So some money reaction function, demand function, supply function, everything under uncertainty. Then you have a closed model. And then if you solve for inflation, you get the following relationship. So you can model inflation, any inflation shock today, having an effect of inflation expectations tomorrow. And you see that you can do this recursively. So you have basically a term structure of expectations. You can see how one inflation shock today can affect the whole future, your whole set of future expectations. And if you have a rational guy who knows all the coefficients, then you can directly infer this. However, you can assume that people are unsure how those coefficients are, especially one of those which measure the responsiveness or the attitude of the central bank towards inflation shocks. So the higher the attitude, the higher this coefficient, lower attitude, the more inflation the central bank might generate. So you can compare the rational expectation one against some learning one, and we use a fairly standard Kalman learning. So you want to estimate those coefficients. So this is a set of coefficients. Well, depend on the lag one times this new signal weighted by the variance and some learning technology. So under recursive learning, you know that any shock affect expectations at very long horizons, and then we have this co-movement between short and long-run expectations. And then you can map this into a graph and then see how this matters, how this changes if you have a rational expectations with known targets, recursive learning with known target, and recursive learning with time-varying target. And this is the response, so you have a 100% shock. And then see how your expectations over quarters of the future change. If you have a rational guy, well, it adjusts immediately the first inflation expectations, and then the longer term expectations are adjusted, not anymore. If you have a guy who has to learn those parameters, who's unsure about the parameters of the central bank, well, you see that the horizon is much, much longer, so there are short-run expectations are adjusted, but also his longer-term expectations. And the more uncertain he is, the stronger is the path through. So the more uncertain the guy is about how the monetary policy is, the higher the co-movement. Okay. Then you can adjust this for experience, and Malvedi and Nagel have some papers on portfolio risk, where they, for instance, see that people born in recession have different attitudes to portfolio risk. They do it now for expectations. So we borrow their idea here and apply this for our purpose for the co-movement one. And the main changes is that we have not a gain, which is only dependent on aggregate for all, but this gain and those parameters are now group specific. So we differentiate now between old and young. People that observe this high inflation or observe this old regime, and people that, are quite new to this. And obviously they learn from a different past history. So their co-movement, their attitude towards the central bank must be a different one, or could be a different one. We don't know. We will separate this. It's quite easy to adjust this for these differences, but it highlights some important differences. We know that perhaps gains are decreasing with age, so younger cohorts' expectations are more affected by any given recent shock than expectation of older cohorts, because they have the whole history, so they are learning already quite some time. And if you are just there, you get the first shock, you have to infer. So any shock, if you're young, makes a big difference. Then this individual weighting of past information may vary. So individual can weight all historical observations since birth equally, put more weight on recent experience, or can do something like case belief formation. So they map everything they see now to their past experience. So if they see inflation rate of 5% now, they refer it to a state where inflation was 5% in their past, and then check whether this was a good state or a bad state. Was this a very solid central bank at that time or not? So you can play with those learning technologies. So far, now we take these things to data. We use survey of US consumers. We have quite a long time span. This is the interesting part. We use the panel dimension because we know that about 40% of those respondents are re-interviewed after 6 months, and some are even interviewed over 2 years. So this is quite new and quite useful for us in terms of identification. Then the survey also asks about news. So this will allow us then to map this into the theory which check news responses. So we can check for good and bad news, on prices, on inflation. We can check on credit conditions. And this is what we just did for fun, check on government spending. Because government spending is currently an issue, so we thought whether this might be worthwhile analyzing. The question precisely, the quantitative short-run expectation inflation question asks whether you know by how many percent you expect prices to go up during the next 12 months. And the long-run question asks the same thing, but for a horizon of 5 to 10 years. So we do not know like the exact horizon, but I think it's important to distinguish between something that's business cycle dependent, so to speak, so the next year, and something where business cycle doesn't matter a lot, it's just some long run movement, and this is the 5 to 10 years. So for us, it's not a big drawback that we cannot pinpoint this very exactly, but for us it's basically short run and long run with the business cycle and without. And then I said this new heard question, and this is also quite nicely framed, so it's not like asking you about a specific topic. You are asked whether you heard some news, and then you can reply. So you can reply anything, 70 categories, some news of government, migrants, or whatsoever, and then we sort those news that are about inflation or monetary conditions. So this question doesn't put you into a specific category, but ask you basically what news you find personally important. And if somebody reports prices are going up, this must for him be a very, very important news. Otherwise, he wouldn't choose this. Okay, so this is quite interesting. It should also quite have a substantial impact. Then we also look at some monetary policy shocks. This is for some people that are very keen on identifying monetary policy shock because there's some endogeneity and something like this. I don't go through this. Some other people did this, and we basically use those I shock and alternative monetary policy shocks as defined in the literature. Look at the data. So this is the data we have. So we're coming from a very high inflation regime to quite stable inflation regime, and then things well, are still stable, but the conditions are such that we are very expansionary at the end. And then we will compare, if you look at the cohorts, people that lived here or gained a lot of experience here with people that started a bit later, okay, that do not have this experience of those high inflation rates and start being economically active substantial years later. And then we see if the anchoring is indeed the same for both. And usually literature says, well, there's some difference. We will show you that indeed this matters. So this is summation equation. Again, the change, we explained the change, the long run expectations, so just a very, very simple regression, fix mean and fix alpha, and the change in the short run expectations. For every period of time, we use 36 months just to have more data, but it doesn't matter actually. You can do it also on a monthly basis, but this is the basic regression. And then we're interested basically in this coefficient, okay? And the theory tells you the lower this coefficient, the higher this anchoring of your expectations are. If you have fully anchored expectations, there should be no effect between this and this. So what do we get? We get the following picture. So this is this beta, and we see, well, some variation. This is something due to data issues. So they had the structure of the survey changed a bit, and then became more regulated. So we have here some quite a lot of white noise. But I'm not sure how you see it. I would say this is a quite higher anchoring regime, and this is a different regime. Okay, so to me it seems that there is some increase in the degree of anchoring. We have quite high co-movement, so roughly about 0.35, and here this co-movement went down substantially. And if you do some tests, so some breakpoint tests, you see that, well, up to 95, 96, it stays fairly flat, and then it explodes the test statistic. So indicating that after this time, something happens. And if you dig into literature, there's some discussion going on that in this time some preemptive movements of interest rates happened, that the monetary policy at this time wanted to convince people that they want to really lower inflation rates, they really would like to go down, and increased interest rates preemptively to convince people. And this is somehow reflected here. What we did next is to estimate the probability of co-movement. So one thing is whether you move sufficiently strong, short run, long run, whether this co-movement is done just by a genuine reduction in the co-movement, or just done because long-run expectations do not change at all anymore. Right? So is it really true that you just move in both long-run expectation and short-run expectation at the same time by a lower amount? Or does this anchoring just mean I still move the short-run expectations, but do not move my long-run expectations anymore? Then you have still a lower co-movement. But this would then mean that the probability of co-movement, so any change, should go down as well. And we don't see this. So this means that people still move short-run and long-run expectations, but to a lesser degree. So the long-run expectations are still adjusted, but to a lower extent. It's not that they are completely ignored anymore. Yes?
Is that an endogeneity issue? I mean, the short run
There's clear, I mean, there's a term structure of those, right? There must be an endogen because the short run are a part of the long run. I just want to know which part they are, right? Are they a big one? So is the influence very, very strong, or is it very, very little? Well, the model tells you that there is there must be, right? The model tells you that you have a term structure basically here, and every shock in the long run expectations must somehow affect long run expectation. I'm interested only in the degree, the strength of it. It's a really it's a strength.
Thinking about, you know, the instrumental variables type issues. That's boring.
Well,
Trigonometry issues.
yeah, I know. Yeah, I know, and rightly so. But from this perspective, I'm only interested. I fully agree. I like instruments if I do instrument. But in this paper, I do a model approach, right? So from the model, this tells me this must run in this direction. And I trust completely the model, as always.
A simple solution is you do it as a linear probability model as opposed to a Probit type model.
Yeah.
It's much easier to instrument it if you can use a lag value or something like that. I mean, just a
No, that's okay. Yeah, sure. No, this is a fair point. This is something you can do. Yeah, sure. Okay, so we have a quite now a lower co-movement and the sim probability. So we have general adjustment and short run, long run expectations. That's the test for this. And then we split this into young and old. Every time I see 40 and young, I think of Economist Award, Young Economist Award. It's a joke, but now we are already in this age. So anyway, so we split between 40 and 60. And people born before 95, so were economically active until this 80s, and people that started being really economically active after the 80s, so after this reduction in inflation rates. So people that observed these high inflation rates and lived with those inflation rates compared to people that just came up when everything was good or not. And then we compare the two graphs. So we have here this 50 against 60s, 60 against 40s, and again, these are the two graphs. This is just the means. What you could see, I'm not sure if I can convince you here, is that the red line, which are the young boys, this line is a bit smoother, or a bit lower, or a bit smoother than the old people. But the old people seem to react a bit stronger to inflation shock. So we have here this run. This overall is quite, a bit more stable than the older cohorts. So the older cohorts is still more sensitive. And this can be reconciled with the learning. Well, they experience this high inflation rate. So every time you see movements in inflation rate, they overshoot because the learning is calibrated and at this past experience, while the young people, which through lived this quite stable period after the 90s, were able to compensate, were able to calibrate at very low levels of inflation. And then if you test this, you can mean and standard deviation, you find for this period that the born after have a higher mean and a higher variance compared to the young population. The young people have more stable expectation, a co-movement, and a lower variation in co-movement. So they're insensitive to those things. So they are coming closer to this rational expectation people where the movement, the co-movement is very, very low. And I think this is the last thing I discussed. Remember, the model tells you that you have also different impact in terms of inflation shock. I just wanted to compare the co-movement between inflation and expectations. And the model should say if you have an anchoring, this means that the inflation shocks should still be there. So the co-movement change in inflation shock should be similar, but there should be less effect on the long run expectations. And this is what you see after roughly 1996. Here you can make no difference, or statistically no difference. Here you see that the impact of inflation shocks dies out after 1996. So it quite nicely represents what the model should tell you, disaggregated and short and long run inflation expectations. And then we estimated this newest effects, and basically what we find is that after 1996, we can take any breakpoint, most of the news effects die out, so try to test or use the arguments of the literature on news effects, and we find similar effects here, so that the responsiveness to news using this anchoring way of describing anchoring finds quite similar effects for probit and for the normal co-movement. So to conclude, we use a specific way to measure co-movement. We find that this co-movement declined after 1996. We can conjecture that expectation become more anchored. We find that this is not representable in a way if you look at the probabilities, so it's a genuine way that expectation become more anchored. We can see that persistence matters and that news effects are important. And I think I'm missing the most important thing, that we have also the difference between those cohorts. Right? So that indeed this calibration matters, that indeed matters whether you have a past experience of high inflation or low inflation, and then bringing us back to this discussion about 2% or 4% inflation. It's not so innocent. Once you switch the inflation target, it doesn't necessarily mean that everybody will then believe you are going back to 2%. Some people will still believe that you have this 4% inflation target. So just moving or anchoring inflation expectations is not as easy as the aggregate would like to believe. Thanks.